we've done this in the past, and it's a lot of fun. So I, as Scott mentioned, I'm a deputy city attorney. I've been with the San Francisco City Attorney's Office for about 8 years. And I have a really cool, pretty unique job in the government, which I really like. And I'm happy to tell you a little bit about it and some of the pros and cons here at the outset, and then answer any questions you all have. The city attorney's office, has some cool powers under state law that allow us to bring affirmative cases as plaintiffs in the name of the people of the state of California. And so in that respect, we get to operate a bit like the California Attorney General's office, but we do it in a kind of wide range of issue areas across a bunch of sort of sectors and different core issues. And so I can just share with you some of the cases I've worked on to give you a sense of the variety. These are sort of just winding down now, but I was part of the litigation team in some of our Trump administration cases. The city sued the Trump administration on a whole variety of measures. I litigated the public charge case where we challenged a Trump administrative rule that was going to make it more difficult for immigrants to access public benefits. And we succeeded in getting that rule shut down. And now under a new administration, they're sort of unwinding that rule in any case. I've been helping litigate our case against Uber and Lyft for misclassifying thousands of their drivers. And that's in partnership with the city attorneys of Los Angeles and San Diego and the California Attorney General's office. And so that's been kind of a unique for public law office partnership. And that's been interesting and active litigation. I am part of our climate change litigation team. So we have sued the 5 largest oil companies in the world for causing climate change, just a small little case there. And we're specifically sort of seeking redress for the consequences that will befall the city and county of San Francisco in terms of having to rebuild and fortify public infrastructure to deal with the consequences of climate change. Most kind of obviously for us in San Francisco is sea level rise. And right now I'm also sort of enmeshed in some new litigation against the San Francisco Unified School District. This has been sort of in the news a little bit, but the school district is separate and apart from the city and the city attorney's office. And San Francisco has dragged its feet a bit on reopening the public schools, and there have been some pretty significant consequences for our students. And at this point in the pandemic, it's our view that there are no sufficient public health bases for not reopening the schools. And so we've been fighting a bit on that front. So, and yeah, the list sort of goes on and on, but hopefully that gives you a little feel for the kind of wide range of things that I and our team have been working on. I should mention the whole office is like 150 lawyers. We represent the city and county of San Francisco in all matters, litigation, non-litigation. I'm part of this sort of 10 or 12 lawyer team that does all these affirmative cases where we're typically suing bad guys or who we perceive to be bad guys. I'll just say, at a high level, like I hope the pros of this are obvious. Like these are really cool and important cases. We're using government resources to kind of do good in the world. And these are cases we tend to feel really good about and trying to get positive outcomes. And they're incredibly varied by, these examples I hope you'll see, which makes it interesting. We're diving into new areas of law all the time. Sort of in theory, I'm an expert at litigating these big, complex civil cases, but the specific issue areas, we have to sort of learn fresh and anew every time we get into a big new case. So as you can imagine, that's both fun and interesting. Sort of, I guess, shifting briefly to a couple downsides or concerns or things to think about. And I'll just start with that. One, it's a harrowing sort of practice in the sense that like, I often feel like I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. I'm having to learn new things all the time, which is fun, but also, challenging and a little bit intimidating at times. And the only other, I'd say, sort of downsides or challenges to the practice are just those that I think are often associated with big, complex civil litigation, which is, we operate and live at the whims of judges who often impose kind of grueling schedules that are to their convenience, right? So my work-life balance is often at the mercy of judges, and those schedules and demands can be punishing at times. The cases I work on tend to be so large and of such consequence to the defendants that we don't always have the best relationships with opposing counsels. These are kind of like bet the company kind of cases in some circumstances, and it at least in some cases leads to tension and tense relationships with large opposing counsels. And depending on your disposition and how you manage to kind of manage stress, there are some real challenges dealing with big, aggressive, mean opposing counsels. And the cases, they take a long time. And so there is some downside associated with, some folks in my office, just by way of example. One of the prominent cases we've litigated on our team was against the manufacturers of lead paint for all the consequences that befall people who largely live in like public housing, and the big lead paint manufacturers were using lead paint for decades before it was eventually banned, when they knew it had these terrible health consequences, particularly for young people. We filed that case in early 2000 in partnership with a few other cities and counties in California. And it finally came to a resolution just last year. And so we were actively litigating that case for literally 20 years. And so some of my colleagues were there doing that the entire time. And so you can appreciate that the scale and longevity of those cases poses some challenges too. You often don't get these easy wrap-ups and nice victories along the way. So at the outset, those are just some of the pros and cons and some of what I'm doing. And I'll look forward to talking more and answering any questions.
Great, thank you. And I believe Lisa has joined by phone. Is that right, Lisa? Are you on?
Yes, I am on, Scott. Thank you, and sorry for my delay.
Oh, no worries. And I'm really sorry that we're having some technical issues to get you in by video, but I'm really glad that you're able to join by phone. Lisa, why don't we turn to you? And since Matt just told us a little bit about his role at the San Francisco City's Attorney's Office, maybe you can talk a little bit about what you did there and what your life was like.
Yes, actually, very interesting to follow Matt, because my experience, in fact, my most recent experience was pretty much the direct opposite. My last 15 years in the office and another stint earlier on, I did juvenile dependency cases, which in essence are, our office represents the San Francisco Department of Human Services in actions where they seek to remove from parents abused and neglected children. And this, frankly, it's probably closest to criminal law as compared to what Matt does. The cases are very quick. The statutory timeframes are very, very fast. By design, by statute, the cases are also not supposed to be contentious. I mean, they're very passionately litigated, as you might imagine, but the law suggests that parties work together for the benefit of, obviously, the kids and maintaining families. So that type of practice, which is pretty unique in our city attorney's office, really suited me. I like the fast pace. I like the being in court all the time. I like the fact that the case is turned over quickly. And so if you had a particularly terrible one, you would move on to your next 10 or 20. And there was always a different experience, a different set of issues. Now, not to say the cases did at different procedural stages, you kept a case from beginning to end. So you could have a case for 2 or 3 or 5 years until it was ultimately finalized, but a very different practice experience than what Matt described. Some of the things that I particularly loved about the city attorney's office were the fact that I did get to do a lot of different things. I got to be at a couple of different departments. I was at the port for a number of years doing admiralty cases and commercial bankruptcy cases and commercial real estate cases. So again, pretty much the opposite of what I ended up doing in the juvenile realm. There was the ability to transfer, to try something new, get a different set of experiences, which I really appreciated. Another thing that was very important to me and was a particular feature of the city attorney's office was I am a parent and had 3 young children, and of course was trying to juggle both working and raising my children. And the city attorney's office offered me, particularly my early part of my career, a huge amount of flexibility. I was able to work part-time, half-time, actually 50% time, for a number of years when my kids were very small. And that was invaluable. I don't know that I would have been able to continue working without that flexibility. And I think that's something to consider, obviously not just for women, but men as well. Quality of life issues are huge, and not just being a parent, but perhaps you have other family issues or aging parents or, any number of personal issues in your life. And flexibility, I think, is really important. Now, this is not to say that you can, and I did neglect my work at all. There was still an awful lot of demands on my time professionally. And, you often feel that you're kind of shortchanging everybody when you're juggling a lot of balls. But having the kind of flexibility that I was able to have in the city attorney's office was critical, both in my professional development and my personal life as well.
That's great.
Okay, I'll stop and I'm happy to answer any questions or elaborate when we get further along.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa. Derek, why don't we turn to you? You're at Caltrans. Tell us about that.
Sure. So let me just give you the background of how I got where I am. I graduated from Hastings in 2003, and I started in private practice, and I worked for a couple of big firms before I moved into public agency practice. So when I was in law school, I had no idea that this is where I would wind up. I think I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought at the time that I was not going to do litigation, and I have wound up doing litigation. So I think that the lesson there, to the extent there is one, is keep your doors open. You may not know where you wind up eventually. But as I said, I started in big firms, and I worked in big firms for about 7 years, and then that was when I moved over to Caltrans, and I've been there for about 12 years now. And I did that largely for the same reasons that Lisa mentioned, that my wife and I my wife is a lawyer as well. We were both at private law firms at that point, and starting to have kids, and it wasn't really going to work for us to have both of us continue in that lifestyle. So I was very happy to be the one to leave firm life and go into public service. And I've been very, very, very happy with that transition since I made it. So, lifestyle wise, it's been much better for me personally. I think some people do prefer the big firm lifestyle for a number of reasons. But I very much enjoyed being at Caltrans. So when I was in private practice, I actually started doing transactional work, and then started dabbling in a little bit of litigation and started doing land use and environmental work. And it was in that context that I developed a love for appellate law. And one of the nice things about being at Caltrans is it's allowed me to specialize in the things I want to specialize in. So one of the interesting things about Caltrans is it is the only state agency that does its own in-house litigation work. So every other state agency uses the Attorney General's office. Most state agencies do have their own in-house counsel that does the non-litigation legal work. But Caltrans has its own in-house litigation staff, its own in-house attorneys. So what we get as Caltrans attorneys is we get the benefit that you would get at the Attorney General's office or in a city attorney's office or county council, where you are handling a wide array and a broad variety of cases. But we get that mixed with the benefit of essentially being in-house counsel, where you have one consistent client that you deal with, and you do need to develop an understanding of the client's business. And it's something that you don't always get if you're somewhere like the Attorney General's office, where you're going to be shifting from one matter to another with representing different state agencies. So Caltrans itself, statewide, we have about 130 attorneys, and there are 4 legal offices statewide. And I work in Oakland in our Bay Area legal office, and we have about 30 attorneys there. The nature of the work that Caltrans attorneys handle, as I said, is pretty broad. We basically, well, I mean, there are, a dozen different areas of practice we have, which, with regular matters. I mean, a lot of other areas, but the biggest ones we have, you can really divide it into 2 halves of the house. And one is the environmental real property work. Caltrans is the largest landowner in the state with over 50,000 miles of the state highway system. And there's obviously a lot of legal work involved in owning the state highway system and operating the state highway system, both in terms of ongoing infrastructure maintenance and improvement, and also in terms of new projects where we have to either improve the existing infrastructure or acquire property to build a new bridge or some new part of the state highway system. And in that context, and that's what I do is on the environmental and appellate side. The other half of what we do for the most part is the tort work, and that's a lot of trial practice. So basically anybody who gets injured on the state highway system may bring a lawsuit against Caltrans alleging injuries caused most often by a dangerous condition of public property. So our trial lawyers will handle those dangerous condition lawsuits in the trial court. And that's probably, more than 50% of what our office practices. I haven't done that work. I do it on appeals. And as I said, I do a lot of the environmental work, which is really appellate in nature. And one of the interesting things about my practice and Caltrans practice is that we get to practice in both state and federal courts, despite being a state agency. We have entered into an agreement with Federal Highways where the state has agreed to waive sovereign immunity and allow itself to be sued in federal court in exchange for assuming responsibility from Federal Highways for compliance with a wide range of federal environmental laws. So what that's allowed us to do is develop a practice in federal court as well, which has been pretty interesting. So again, I do focus mostly on appellate law, which I love. I don't particularly enjoy trial practice. And so one of the nice things about working at Caltrans is it's allowed me to focus on the areas that I'm interested in and develop expertise in those areas. In a general sense, the things I like about where I've worked, I mentioned the, greater flexibility you have for being in a public office as opposed to working in a big firm. And that's been true. Obviously, we're still lawyers, we're still licensed members of the bar. So when we have cases and deadlines, it's not a 9-to-5 job by any stretch, but it's a more humane environment, and I've definitely preferred that. The flexibility in terms of picking my practice area has been nice. That's been a big positive for me. Negatives, I think to me the biggest thing is I often feel like everybody hates us, and that might be something that's unique to Caltrans. I don't think that the city attorney office probably feels that way, but for Caltrans, in particular, and it might be unique to Caltrans as a state agency also, but I think it's an easy target. It's a big, attractive target. Caltrans owns so much of the state, so much property in the state highway system, and it's easy for things to go wrong. And anytime something goes wrong, people get angry at Caltrans. But just also, I think we find ourselves at kind of the intersection of the anti-developer sentiment, because Caltrans is a developer agency, where that meets the anti-government zeitgeist. So we kind of get both sides of that, and often those are on opposite sides, and they kind of seem to converge on us. So in every litigation we have, we're demonized and vilified, and I've definitely had cases where, often when I get to court on a big high-profile case where we are taking down trees, which we do for seemingly every project, a lot of people don't like that. A lot of people show up to the courtroom and let me know about it, and I'm there as the representative of the department, and so I'm the one people are going to take it out on. And I get a lot of nasty comments on my way into court, my way out of court, and so that's not always pleasant. And at the end of the day, it can make you feel like where's the reward for working for the public sector? So you kind of have to remind yourself that there's value in what you're doing, and it's just part of kind of a natural part of the process that people aren't necessarily going to like a lot of what the state agency is doing. So I'd say that's the negative, but it does not outweigh the positive. And another thing that I always point out when I come talk to Scott's class is, when you go into public service, there are a lot of very generous benefits depending on where you work. And they can have their own kind of golden handcuff effect, that a lot of the pension benefits in particular really provide their value if you stay put, and you stay put for the long term. So it can feel somewhat restrictive if you go down that path and say after 8-10 years you think, well, maybe I'll branch out and find something else. That can be a big factor in making you feel compelled to stay where you are. And it's just something to be aware of if you are considering going down that route. That I think that, to me, it's a big factor. I've seen that in other colleagues, that it can be a big factor that can affect decisions to make changes in one's career path. So I'll just leave it at that and wait for questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I have just a question, because, well, first, it's striking that each of you does something very different from the others. And that's a product, I suppose, of the great diversity and variety that public litigation has to offer. But you're all working for the man. So I wanted to ask, what are your views on and perspectives on the level of autonomy that you had to pursue the cases that you wanted to pursue in the ways that you want to, and independence versus any politics that might come into play and dictate any particular course of action that you might otherwise not want to take. So Lisa, why don't I start with you? Can you talk a little bit about the kind of autonomy and independence you had versus what, if any, kind of political pressure that you might have felt working for the San Francisco City Attorney's Office?
Yes, and I'll start actually, if I may, by responding to something that Derek said. There is varying degrees of anti-government sentiment, and even in the work I did, or I shouldn't say even, in the work I did, there was an awful lot of sort of the government is bad and it's coming in and separating families and sort of that kind of thing. I tried. Actually, it didn't bother me very much, because I was very lucky in that one of the things that I absolutely loved about what I did was, at the end of the day, pretty much every day, I felt that I was doing something good. I had helped a kid that day. And that's a wonderful feeling. I mean, yes, I'm working for the government, and et cetera, et cetera. But that was a really good feeling. And for me, that was I can't describe how satisfying that is to have that feeling in your work, whatever it is you're doing. But for me, that was a really key factor. So to your question, Scott, when I was doing juvenile dependency work, and I think I was very lucky. This is I think a function a lot of who your immediate supervisor is, and then of course Dennis Herrera is the big city attorney. But the immediate supervisor I had, who's also a Hastings grad, I must throw in, was terrific. I had complete autonomy, and I mean we settled cases all the time. I mean every day you'd settle 2 or 3 or 5 cases, and I could do that with complete freedom. Now, part of that, of course, was I was an experienced lawyer. Part of it was that I knew enough to let her know if something was really going to blow up or really going to go south. But I had complete autonomy with the cases that I handled. That was not always the case, and I will not minimize the fact that the city attorney's office is a political office, and I think it is generally, but it also is dependent upon who is sitting in the chair of the city attorney. Dennis is certainly very politically savvy. His predecessor was very politically savvy, and she exerted more political pressure, I think, on her deputies than Dennis has. When I was at the port, which is much more visible in terms of city politics and land use and all those kinds of issues, political forces were brought to bear on the work we did. And you're absolutely right. You accept that in a government office. You don't operate in a vacuum. But I was fortunate in the later big chunk of my career that dependency is a it's not high profile. The hearings are confidential for one, but it's not very high profile, and it doesn't get the big headlines like land use decisions or complex litigation, those kind of things. And so maybe because of that as well, fortunately, I had a lot of autonomy, which also works for me personally.
Thank you, Lisa. Matt, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick follow-up, and maybe to be just slightly provocative here, Scott. I mean, I think you said that by working for the government, in some respects, we work for the man. I would posit, just to contrast, when you're at Paul Weiss or Gibson Dunn working for Exxon or Chevron, you perhaps are more working for the man than we are in the public sector. And on the kind of autonomy and independence front, semi-related, I tend to think, on balance, we in the public sector end up having more autonomy and independence, at a comparable stage in our career than young associates at very hierarchical large law firms who often are having to follow the will of their clients, regardless of the merits of that. So it's an interesting contrast to think about. And in my experience, and this of course is not always true, but it's right that our bosses, and ultimately the city attorney himself, in this case, who is an elected official, are political actors. But typically what that means is they're seeking to operate what they believe to be in the public interest and are ultimately answerable to the electorate, And I tend to think, in my experience, that type of disposition and orientation and political pressure has always been somewhat favorable. And those are kind of the constraints that I'm actually quite comfortable operating under when engaged in kind of high profile big litigation that we're attempting to do, again, what we think is in the public interest. So yeah, just a slightly different spin.
Yeah, I get it. Derek, any thoughts on your end?
Yeah, as far as the autonomy, I've had tremendous autonomy working at Caltrans, and that's probably been the single best aspect of my experience there is, and I don't think it's unique. I think it will vary depending on, the office you work in and also who your supervisor is, that kind of thing. But for me, and looking around my office and statewide, there's definitely opportunity for autonomy. I mean, there are fewer resources, and so I think that's widely understood when you work in a public law office, you're going to be thrown into the fire a lot sooner. And I've told this story before, but when I first left private practice and came to Caltrans, I had been there for just a few months, and I was handling an appeal entirely on my own, and I had just filed the appellate brief, and I got together with a couple of former colleagues from the firm I had been at most recently, and I mentioned that, and I forget their exact response, but basically they were incredulous. They were kind of joking and couldn't believe that I had had that opportunity, because at a firm, you're far less likely to get that opportunity early on. So the autonomy has been the best part, the most rewarding part. It is balanced against the politics, but I think less so, kind of as Matt was saying, than in private practice. I think there are far greater constraints against that autonomy. Mainly, you've got the paying client, and when you're working on a case and you've got a large client, the partner managing the bills for that has got to be really careful about where those bills go, and being able to answer to the client why this junior associate was allowed to handle this, or why this associate was allowed to run up these bills. We don't have those same constraints for the most part in a public agency. We do have the limits. Everything we do has to be consistent with the mission of the department. And for Caltrans, we are answerable to the governor. So from time to time, we get oversight from the governor's office. But I can't even think of an instance where that's been a problem. Like, it's not as if it's ever the case where an attorney has a matter and is running with it, and then the governor's office has to step in and say, you've been handling this all wrong. I think, most often it would have to do with settlement, because we need approval from the governor's office to settle cases over a certain threshold. We just have to make sure our messaging is consistent. And I think that's where I have to be very careful, and all of the attorneys in our office have to be very careful when we go to court and we are approached by either the media or members of the public. We have to be very careful with what we say, because what we say is essentially speaking for the entire department. And so for the most part, we are not supposed to speak with the media. We're supposed to direct the media and members of the public to contact the department's public information office, get official statements that way, which ironically are then drafted by the attorneys and given to the public information office. But nonetheless, they don't want us speaking extemporaneously, outside the courtroom. So you do have to be careful about that kind of thing, because, you say something and it's going to wind up in the media. And then in that sense, the politics comes into play. But I have not found that to be much of a constraint on the autonomy that I've been able to develop in my career.
Great. So we've talked a lot in this course about the arc of one's career, and that litigation really offers opportunities for people to sort of move in and out of different jobs or different roles. And so I'm wondering where government service might fit. Is it a place what are the exit and entrance points, basically? Do you hire people right out of law school? Do people mostly come after having some, experience that they've developed in a particular either subject matter or a particular kind of, firm practice? And where do people go when they are done with government service? I imagine, as Derek said, the long-term benefits are really great, and people tend to stay for a long time. But I also imagine that people might move on to different things, and I'm wondering what those might be. So, Derek, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So our office has been pretty flexible in terms of the type of attorney that we will take on. Most recently, we have been adding a lot of junior attorneys, including some brand new entry-level attorneys straight out of law school. I'd say that's probably more common, but not exclusive by any stretch. We have added some far more experienced attorneys, people with over 10 years of practice. I can't think of any instances where we have added anybody with much more experience than that. So it's not the case where we would get a lateral with, 20 years of experience, or maybe even 15. If we have, it's probably more likely that that lateral is coming from another public agency. Typically, the laterals that join Caltrans earlier on in their career are coming from private practice, and they're going to be often in a similar position as I was, where they're at a point in their lives where they need to, the greater flexibility and more humane lifestyle that public sector is going to offer compared to private practice. But not always, and probably more often, the junior attorneys we get either straight out of law school or lateraling in after just a couple years of practice are committed to public service, and that's, they've never been to private practice. So we do get both kinds. Exit points, I'd say the most common thing we've seen is people leaving Caltrans to go to another public agency for one reason or another. I don't know, I guess there have been a couple of attorneys who have left to go to private practice, but that's pretty rare. I know when I was in private practice, we had a couple of very experienced public agency attorneys who came and joined one of the firms I was at. So, it does happen. And I think often when it does happen, it's attorneys who have been in the public service for 20 or more years, and they're at a point in their life where they have more time. Perhaps your kids are grown out of the house, and they can afford the much longer hours that the private practice is going to demand. And maybe it's an opportunity to earn a lot more money by going back into private practice. But that's definitely more rare. I think more often when people leave Caltrans, they'll go to another public agency office.
Matt, how about the city attorney's office?
So I guess in our office, I would say in general, it's harder to get in at the beginning of your career, right? I think this is not always true, and it sounds like Derek has some slightly contrary experiences in his agency, but government entities tend to have less resources to train young lawyers. So absent some specific kind of honors programs or specific programs to bring in brand new lawyers, I think it's more common that people kind of lateral in. And in our office, that can be anywhere from like 2 to 5 years, 2 to 10 years even. So I would say tougher to break in at the beginning. People tend to come in, and they come in though from a variety of places, oftentimes from big firms. I spent the early part of my career as a legal aid lawyer in the nonprofit sector. So we see some people coming in through that sector. We do such a wide range of things as a city, and I think you've probably gotten a little bit of a feel for that we tend to then just bring in people who have the specific expertise that fits into a particular team or area of the office. As you all have alluded to, people tend to stay for a long time, and I think some of the attractiveness of the public sector and the balance and the work-life balance tends to be things that you can appreciate perhaps a little bit later in your career. So more often than not, those are kind of the periods when you would stay late into your career. But people do exit. I've certainly seen colleagues who have gone to other public agencies, or there's a robust private practice of lawyers who interface with or deal with the public sector, right? So people have left our office and gone to big firms and helped specialize in their kind of public sector practices, where they're helping large clients defend themselves from government actions. Or, there's a robust set of private law firms in different sizes and configurations that provide, services, litigation services, and other kinds of attorney services to public agencies. So you could be at a law firm and have your clients be public sector clients, including the San Francisco City Attorney's Office. So I think there's a pretty broad variety of entry and exit points and different sectors where people come from and go to.
Great, thank you. Lisa, anything to add?
Just a couple of things. I certainly agree with what Matt said. I think he's absolutely right. When I started in the city attorney's office, this was many, many years ago. I had worked for a brief time at the Court of Appeal as a research attorney, and then at a civil firm in San Jose, which was great, but I didn't want to keep going to San Jose. And when I came in, so I was a very new lawyer, not brand new, but very inexperienced. And Matt is absolutely right. There was no training program. It was pretty much, here you go, here's the file, run with it, which was scary, of course, but you really learn a lot that way, and I did. So it's not like that anymore. I don't think anybody comes in anywhere near as new and inexperienced as I was. As to Matt's point about specific practice areas, what we have, my team, because it is such a specific area, and you really have to be interested in it to keep doing it. We have hired, the last couple of lawyers we've hired are fairly young lawyers with a few years experience, but they were former interns on our team. So they are familiar with the practice area and understand not only the legal part of it, but the emotional challenges as well. I would also say that my anecdotal experience is that because folks, I think in government practice generally, but certainly in the city attorney's office, get litigation experience far faster than young associates in big firms, that I think if you leave city attorney's office or any other governmental agency and you've had some litigation experience, you are way ahead of your peers. And so a guy that I used to work with just left the city attorney's office and went to a firm, and he's been out about 6 or 7 years, and he's far ahead of his contemporaries just in terms of his litigation experience as a result of what he used to do in the city attorney's office. So I agree that there are entry level is a little more difficult now. I think very few people, if any, come in right out of law school or even a year or two out. But their exit points, I think you're a pretty valuable commodity if you leave the city attorney's office and any governmental agency, frankly.
Thank you. So I think I'll